Hi, thank you for joining me for this lecture on George D. Mason. My name is Paula Draper, and my background is in electrical engineering. I received my undergraduate bachelor's degree from University of Illinois in Champaign-Urbana, followed by my master's degree from Oakland University, followed by a graduate of the Chrysler Institute of Engineering. So with my background in engineering and automotive being the focus, how did I end up as a realtor that I am today and lecturing on architects in the area? Well, it goes back to my childhood. Actually, when the first time I had a chance to go in one of the mega mansions out in Newport, Rhode Island, I had the privilege of touring the breakers for the first time and really fell in love with Richard Morris Hunt and his design and all that those properties had to offer. So basically, I've been hooked since I was a child, and lo and behold, now as a realtor, I get to present this kind of information, which is a passion of mine for the area that I currently live in the Grosse Pointes. So let's start talking here about George Mason. This is the fourth lecture I've presented through the library series, through Grosse Pointe Public Libraries. The first was on Hugh T. Keyes, followed by Robert O. Derrick, then Wallace Frost, and now we're doing George D. Mason. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about Mason. So he was originally born in July 4th, 1856 in Syracuse, New York. His father was James Mason, and his mother was Zeta Elizabeth Griffin. His mother was 19 when they married, and his dad was 24. George was the oldest of 5 siblings and the only son to be born of the children. So he was basically born to teach and lead, just given his position in the family. His oldest sister was Anna Lulu Mason McDonald. She lived a long 86 years, and Anna and George were very close throughout their lives, as we'll see later on in the presentation. She married Donald J. McDonald in 1879, and they lived at 1616 West Boston Boulevard. They, at some point in time, moved to Farmington, Michigan, and her husband, Donald, was very active with Detroit newspapers as well as the advertising circles, which is likely why we see a lot of research on George was from the Detroit Free Press, where he was featured just about every month for his very long 70-plus years in the architecture industry. Anna and Donald had 4 children, 3 sons, who lived into adulthood, and one of them he named Mason. The next daughter born to George Mason's parents was Evelyn Viola Mason. She married David James Stevenson in 1881. They had 4 children, including 3 daughters and 1 son. George had another sister named Lillian Mason. She was born in 1866, and we don't know anything about her. The records just say deceased beyond that, so she may have been stillborn or lived a very short life, but was clearly never forgotten by the family, as we'll find out later. The youngest daughter born of the family was Florence Mason, who lived a very short 29 years. In 1870, George's family moves to Detroit from New York so his father could find some factory work. In 1873, Mason graduates from Detroit High School and goes to work as an apprentice as a draftsman. Interestingly enough, he had been a student of Emma Bellman Jacklin, a teacher and a VP of Cass Union School. She was also the wife of Reverend J. E. Jacklin. Mrs. Jacklin's great uncle was the Reverend James Cretan from Ireland, and he'd been a valuable aide to Mr. John Wesley, whose name is likely familiar to many people as he was the founder of the Methodist Church in England. So given that background, we know that George Mason had a very strong Protestant upbringing, and he noted several days a week of church attendance on a regular basis in his private journals, which are available for research and where I got a lot of information from. An interesting note I found, too, was the very first time we see him published in the Detroit Free Press was in 1874. And he was listed as, quote, a young George D. Mason, selected as a designer of the State Agricultural Society diploma. And it was a design for a steel plate engraving. And there's an image of this on this first slide. So what do you think? This diploma was for, like what school does it represent today. And many people, when I gave this presentation in June, were aware that this was actually one of the first diplomas for Michigan State University. So following on in George Mason's life, we have his wife, Ida Whitaker. So Ida was born in Detroit in 1860. Her father was Captain Byron Whitaker, and her mother was Fidelia Moore. Interesting story about Captain Whitaker from his obituary. So he was born in Buffalo, New York, and he was the owner of an ice business as well as a shipping fleet where they shipped grain products. In May 1907, Captain Whitaker passed away just 9 hours before his 220-foot ship named the Byron Whitaker sunk in a collision with the John C. Galt, another shipping vessel on the Detroit River. The Galt was later fined $53,000. And here's a little fun fact that you do a little digging you can find. If you actually Google the Byron Whitaker, you will find an image of a ship that is for sale as a poster at Walmart, believe it or not. But I can tell you that that is a fake, and that was proven by the Smithsonian. So interestingly enough, sometimes you have to really double check your research to make sure you're getting accurate information. When Captain Whitaker passed away, he left $20,000 in an estate to his heirs. As we mentioned, Ida's mother was Fidelia Moore, and she also was originally from New York, and her parents did marry in May 17th, 1852. A little bit of a side note was about Ida's maternal grandmother, Mrs. Huldah Terry Moore, who died in 1904 at the incredible age of 93. She had been living in Detroit since the 1830s. So Ida's mother had been in Detroit most of her life. So Mrs. George D. Mason, or Ida Whitaker, had 4 siblings, including Allison Whitaker, who lived to be a long 90 years old, Charles Whitaker, who lived to be 80 years old. He had been widowed twice with no children, and he worked as a bond and insurance businessman. And he passed away on April 5th, 1934, in his summer home in Indian River, Michigan. We know a little bit about Mrs. Albert or Carrie W. Allen, who lived to be 79 years old. She married Albert W. Allen in 1879. They had 2 sons, but sadly only one of them made it to adulthood. Finally, we have William H. Whitaker, her last brother, who lived to age 49. We don't know much about him. In 1875, we see that Ida graduated from Barstow School, which was built in 1871, and there's an image of it here. In 1880, we find this fun article in the Detroit Free Press, which really shows what the times were like and how different they are from today. There was a list of women in the Detroit area that were, quote, receiving calls, and we see Ida Whitaker's name listed as receiving calls at 918 Howard Street. So she was basically ready to accept suitors. So George and she married on May 30th, 1882, at Ida's family home at 461 Congress Street in Detroit. We see Mrs. Mason had a very strong Detroit community involvement in the activities she did throughout her life. She was a poet and also a contributor to the Detroit Free Press. In 1906, she supported the Women's Auxiliary of the Detroit Newsboys Association and awarded 500 newsies with turkey dinners. This really struck me as interesting because the Grosse Pointe Theater just put on a play as their last play in the spring season of 2024 called The Newsies. In 1907 and 1908, we see that she is an active member of the Bridge Club in Detroit. In 1909, she is the chaperone for what Detroit called Blue Star Day. This was one day where Mrs. W.J. Chitterton, Jr., who was actually the mayor's wife, was attending as mayor of Detroit for the day. An interesting thing we don't seem to do today, but was interesting back on that day. In 1912, we see her as the chaperone for, quote, the Pencil Day in Detroit. And if you Google Pencil Day today, you'll see that there's some National Pencil Day, which I don't really understand the meaning of that. But the Pencil Day in this time was a time when it was a chance to raise funds for the homeless. So there were 1,000 women volunteers that sold 85,000 pencils to help the homeless. And this was in support of the Detroit Board of the Michigan Children's Home. It'd be wonderful to reenact something like this today. Mrs. Mason was also a member of the 20th Century Club, which was a very large women's organization. We see a brochure of that on the bottom of this slide. Also a member of the Women's City Club. We see an image of the historic placard of where that building is and where the city's club had been in attendance. And finally, she was a member of the St. Paul's Guild. Ida Whitaker died on March 31st, 1928. But we see her very close to George throughout their marriage. So George and Ida had one daughter, and this is where we see the name of George's deceased sister come back. They named her Lillian Mason. She was later known as James D. Fulton, Mrs. James D. Fulton of Glencoe, Illinois. The house that she lived in Glencoe is pictured here on the bottom. It does still exist, and this was an image of it from their personal family photos as was collected from the Burton Library in downtown Detroit. Lillian was born on April 25th, 1887. There are many notes of her in her father's daily journals, which we can research as well in the archives, including a note of her 10th birthday, which was noted in his journal, so they must have been planning something significant for that. We also see a note of her first day of school, which was September 18th, 1893, and George noted it to be with Mrs. Thompson, AM only. In 1906, in the Detroit Free Press, we see that Lillian gave an address to the graduating class of 1907 at Central High School. It's not stated as to why she gave the address, but I would speculate that she was likely the top of her class or close to it. In 1910, we see her first marriage to Mr. Hal Craig Smith. He was lived sadly just a short 34 years. We don't read much of him, and his death was just advertised, or the obituary was very short, so I think it was very sudden, and there was not much written about it. They lived at 99 Chandler Avenue. Hal and Lillian had one daughter. Her name was Betty Smith Fulton, as she was later adopted by her stepfather. And Betty lived to a nice old age of 88. One of the articles I found for her, which was really fun, is it said that she rode horses in 1924 and had a dog named Pal. The image here to the left is a picture of Ida, the grandmother, or George Mason's wife, the granddaughter Betty, and their daughter Lillian in 1924, taken at 445 Washington in Glencoe, which is where they lived. The second marriage then was to James Fulton of Chicago. This was for Lillian. They married in 1919, and they originally lived at 4542 Drexel Boulevard, but in 1922, we found images in the family records of them moving to this Washington Avenue house where they resided. George Mason had a lifetime of community involvement within Detroit. He was known as the Dean of Architects at Detroit, and this is one of the reasons why, as you see, just prolific involvement in everything in establishing the city as it was. And we see it from the earliest time. His involvement started very young. At 1881, we see him in the Detroit Sketching Club. In 1882, he was actually a building inspector of Detroit for 8 months. Jumping to 1897, we see him in a club called the Witten Gatemoat Club, which was established in 1885, later more commonly known as the Wiseman's Club. And this one you see written up in the paper several times. They had rooms in the Detroit Club in 1924, and they would meet every Friday evening from November through April at 1014 East Jefferson Avenue. This is from an article in 1935. George Mason was one of 30 active members at that time, so he had a very long involvement in this club. And at the end of the season, they would have a closing dinner at the Detroit Club. Other involvements include the American Association of Advancement of Scientists, the Detroit Architectural Club, which is a sub-club of the American Institute of Architects, the Detroit Archaeological Society. We see this coming up much later in his career. An American Institute of Architects as well. And he did some pretty interesting things with there. In 1907, he was involved in defining what was considered acceptable pay for architects in America. And what they defined, which I found fascinating, was all projects less than $10,000, the commission fee for an architect would be 10%. For projects between $10,000 and $20,000, it would be 7%. For $20,000 to $30,000 would be 6%, and anything over $30,000 would be 5% fee. We find much later on in his career, really mid to end of his career, he was doing hundreds of thousands, if not $1,000,000 deals. But he was defining how all the architects were going to receive their fees throughout America. We see him involved in the Board of Commerce of Detroit at the Public Hall Committee. He was also involved in the International Congress of Architects in Rome. He was one of 10 architects from the U.S. to attend. Here it was stated that the old world must learn from America. And Mason also said that you will see the finest homes on our avenues and out in the Grosse Pointes that art and money can achieve. 20 years ago, Mason said, England was the model, but now American invention, creativity, and finance have surpassed this in a short time. So this was back in 1911. He made these statements. In 1920, we see him on the Board of Trustees for the Veterans of Foreign Wars. And at that time, there were 5,000 Detroit veterans from the First World War. He becomes a member of the Thumbtack Club, which was the Michigan chapter of the American Institute of Architects and the Michigan Society of Architects. Additional advisors and members were Mason, Kahn, Grills, Burroughs, and Stratton. They started hosting shows in 1921. The first show had 500 pieces of architecture drawings by 200 architects throughout the country. Mason and Stratton and Kahn were all part of this organization from the earliest onsets. Starting in 1923, we start to see this annual show being displayed in the Detroit Institute of Arts. Absolutely fascinating how he started becoming involved. We see this in the 20s, and this is a shift in his career of starting to bring design, architects, ideas, sculpting artists, all that into the Detroit area through these types of events. So he was really bringing the idea of design and starting to establish how he wanted the city to be organized this time. In 1928, the University of Michigan honors him with a Master's of Architect degree. He is a member of the board of directors for the Parker Rust Proof and Wolverine Enamel. Getting into the 1930s, he's on the state board of registration for the American Institute of Architects as an advisor. He is part of the Detroit Business Pioneers of Detroit Old Timers Association. He's chairman of the Eastman Association, including William B. Stratton in this involvement. He becomes part of the State Advisory Committee for the Detroit chapter of the American Institute of Architects. In 1940, as we see him wrapping up his career, I mean, he is in his 80s at this point in time, but still very active, as we see in research. He becomes a life membership after more than 35 years in the YMCA. He becomes a Detroit Fellow of the American Institute of Architects. And at this point in time, he has stated, when he's awarded this honor with the American Institute of Architects, that, quote, no person has had a more profound influence on the advancement of architecture in Michigan, on his community's physical development, as well as upon its cultural growth. George Mason was also involved with the Michigan Society, the Detroit Engineering Society, the American Federation of Arts. He was a DAC member, a DYC member, and last but not least, he was a 32-degree Mason. And we see that he included that in his design of the Masonic Temple. So a question for the audience, which I gave in June, and we'll just ask you to think about. So what exactly is a dean? How would you define this title? What are the qualifications of a dean? And so, we think of someone who's highly educated, someone who's a teacher, someone who's got great wisdom that is willing to share it, someone who is defined as a leader. So now we're going to talk about George Mason and the making of a dean. So we're going to jump back to the beginning of his biology. He's done with his education, his high school education, and he starts his first job in 1873, The first architect he works for is Hugh Smith. He works just one summer for Mr. Smith, and he did this specifically to learn how to draw cornices. In 1873, we see him coming to work for Henry T. Bush. There's an image of Henry Bush here on the slide. He worked without pay for 9 months, and then he left working for Brush, to join with Zachariah Rice to join Mason and Rice. A little bit about Brush. Sadly, he suffered from depression, and he ended up taking his own life in 1879, just 1 year after George D. Mason left his company. So jumping to Mason and Rice, let's talk a little bit about Zachariah Rice. The building where he lived, his home, is actually the bottom left image there. So that's Zachariah's home. And it was on Alexandrine Street in Detroit. He was in 1872, he graduated from Detroit High School, and he passed away in 1929. They were in a partnership located at 80 Griswold Street in Detroit for 20 years. The partnership dissolved on January 15th, 1899. Some of the architects that were included in their firms during the time of their partnership included Albert Kahn, who is well known, I'm sure, by anyone listening to this. You don't have to be in Detroit very long to have heard of Albert Kahn. So here's a little fun fact about Albert Kahn I'm not sure if you are aware of, but Kahn was actually discovered by the German sculptor named Julius T. Melchers. Kahn originally wanted to be an artist and a sculptor, but Melchers soon discovered that Albert Kahn was colorblind, so this was not going to be possible. So Melchers introduced Albert Kahn to his good friend and draftsman, George D. Mason, who thought perhaps Mason could bring him on board and teach him the ropes of a draftsman. In 1885, the 15-year-old Albert Kahn came to work for George Mason without pay. Noted in Mason's journals from July 1st, 1885, is a comment that says, Albert Kahn, $35 a month for 6 months. Unbelievable. In 1888, a journal entry also noted that Albert Kahn and Mason had 4 French lessons together. And in 1895, we see a note that Albert Kahn left Mason and Rice to establish his own firm, which there will be another lecture series focusing just on Albert Kahn. One little note before we leave discussion of Kahn is he, at the point of close to his retirement, was the highest paid architect in the country. So I asked the audience, how much do you think he was earning at that time and in his annual salary? And some people said 15,000. We heard 50,000. We heard 100,000. And there was one person in the audience who did know the amount, and that was 500,000 a year. This would have been in the 1930s. The next architect we see working with the company, significant architect I should say, was Herbert G. Wenzel. He ended up being the vice president of the George D. Mason Company once George split off to do his own company. We'll talk about that a little bit more later. He was born in December 7th, 1883. Herbert was actually a graduate from the University of Pennsylvania. He started with Mason in 1912 and became a member of his firm in 1920. He passed away in 1939 at the age of 55 at his home in 4003 Hazelwood Avenue. 2 other architects who worked for Mason who I saw some notoriety for were Albert Clayton MacDonald. This was actually George Mason's nephew, and David H. Williams, Jr. There's some images here of his early staff. I just want to note on the bottom that the image of his staff, there's actually a woman in there, and we will talk a little bit about who that woman is shortly. Next, we're going to talk about when George Mason splits off from Mason and Rice and establishes his own company. He's constantly doing small partnerships with other companies at the same time. So we see him in a multi-partnership situation, likely as he's developing larger buildings as he's going along. So George Mason establishes his company from 1899 to 1948, right up to his death. Established and then incorporated in 1920. It was located at the same location that Mason and Rice had been at, which is 80 Griswold Street. We see that William B. Stratton, who is a Cornell graduate and a fellow AIA member, began working for Mason in 1928. That's just a fun little note. So Mason and Kahn then in 1901 to 1902 had a very short-lived partnership. This is probably as Kahn is getting established on his own. And that partnership was located at 1117 Union Trust Building. And it was quoted in the newspaper as, both these gentlemen and their work are so well known that the public will require no assurance of their ability to or integrity. This partnership was dissolved in 1902. Kahn continued on as a partner with his brother, Julius Kahn, who was a civil engineer. In March of 1902, we see George Mason get into another partnership, Mason and Reed Hill, also located at 80 Griswold. Mr. William Reed Hill was an MIT graduate, a designer, and a draftsman. We see this dissolve fairly quickly in June 1903 with a conflicting situation that was noted in the paper. Mason had established another partnership with W.S. Painter outside of this one, and there seemed to have been some issues with that. So Mason was asked to pay a $5,000 bond in the lawsuit. Eventually, that partnership, like I said, was closed fairly quickly. George Mason did extensive travels throughout America as well as extensive ones abroad. And he was always studying and he's always learning, not just the buildings, but the layouts of cities, as we'll see as he grew in his experience, expertise, and knowledge of the area and the people around it. He started to really develop the city of Detroit again, which is why he became noted as the Dean of Architects in Detroit. So starting with his travels, we see him going early on in Boston with his new wife in 1882. Then we see him take 4 months trips to Europe in 1884, 1922, and 1924. He further goes other European trips, including the Netherlands, Germany, Austria, Italy. And here again, he's studying the layouts of the cities. And he also would attend with other architects in the area. In 1931, we see him go to Texas and California, and then we see him go back to Europe in 1931 to visit a post-war Vienna with Branson Gamber. Branson Gamber, you might recall from another lecture, was a partner of Robert O'Derrick and Gambert and O'Derrick in their early firm. So in addition to working with many architects, George Mason also worked with artists. He needed these to do all the elaborate details and decorations he did on his buildings. So one of the ones we've talked about before was Corrado Perducci. So Corrado's son, Alan, had some 600 plus works from the original studio ledgers that have been made available for research. Including in these were the Masonic Temple from 1920 to 1926, and it is noted that that might be one of the main reasons that Corrado Perducci moved to Detroit, was to work on that building. Here are some images within the public or the private journals and records of George Mason's family, some images of some stone carvings that were created, and it could have been by Corrado or it could have been by Julius T. Melchers, who was a German immigrant, sculpting artist, a teacher, and eventually brewer, as he became an heir to and vice president of Stroh's following his marriage into the family. Melchers is the one who introduced Albert Kahn to George Mason, as we noted earlier. Melchers had a son, Gary, who became a renowned artist as well and eventually settled in Virginia. But we do have samples of his work as the 3 murals that can be seen in the Detroit Public Library. So these images here, the wooden images on the bottom that was used the artist would actually sculpt it in wood. He would create a casting of it, and then that would be shipped off and perhaps done in a larger form or created in by a mason or a marble sculpting artist at an off-site location, and then the final piece would be shipped in. So we see some of like these final pieces up on the top. These are all images that were on that are currently on the Masonic Temple. So George Mason and Company created hospitals, banks, apartment buildings, railway stations, warehouses, office buildings, government buildings, other hotels, and many residences, as well as mausoleums. His work can be found in Detroit, Saginaw, Port Huron, Ann Arbor, Cleveland, Windsor, Ontario, New York, Toronto, and Quebec. So there were countless things that he did and with his magnificent creations. We're just going to touch on a few of them at this point in time. But this is an image here of his office. You can see George sitting on the left, and many of his fellow architects and draftsmen hard at work. So starting out with, we're going to talk about one of his first and earliest works was in 1886. He created the Old Young Men's Christian Academy, or the YMCA. This was located at 36 West Grand Avenue in Detroit. He designed it for a 50% discounted fee of $1,500, and this set the tone for many of the contractors, as many donated the profits or did reduced fee in order to build this building. It was completed for a shocking cost of $110,000, not including furniture. This is at this building Henry Ford taught shop class in the 1890s. In 1965, sadly, this building was torn down. The next building we're going to talk about really briefly is the Grand Hotel. Everybody knows this, up in Mackinac Island. This was built in an old colonial and revival style. The initial design for the Grand Hotel was completed in 1882, but work didn't start until 1887. So I asked the crowd, how long do you think it took to actually build the Grand Hotel once it started construction in 1887? We had times all over the place, and I am shocked to tell you that it was built in just 93 days to, quote, look classic and elegant 100 years from now, which it surely does. So in this design, Mason and his firm stepped away from the stylish Queen Anne and Victorian styles that were popular of his day. And you can see the difference between the YMCA to the left and then the Grand Hotel, very distinctive different styles. So the Grand Hotel was built to be 427 feet long with 286 rooms and the largest front porch in the world, which it still is, at 660 feet, supported by Doric columns. The manager of the Grand Hotel at the time was John O. Plank. Next we see George Mason designed the Belle Isle Police Station and the Belle Isle Barns in 1893 and 1895. George did not design the Belle Isle Casino in 1895 when it was built, and then a new casino in 1903, but he was part of the selecting committee that decided what the design was going to be. In 1898, we see George Mason designing the Detroit Opera House, and it was quoted as being, "It will be as nearly fireproof as possible." It was 4 stories high, and the front was occupied with office rooms. Next, we see him in 1899 creating the International Christian Tent Endeavor. This was created to support 1,000 people with an expected attendance back in June 1899. In 1902, Mason designs the University of Michigan Engineering Building in Ann Arbor. This was actually done in cooperation with Albert Kahn. It was a 94,000, or still is, 94,000 square foot building built for just $275,000. It's no longer used as an engineering building and is located on Central Campus, but is still used by the university today. Mason designed the Belle Isle Aquarium in 1903. And this was a fascinating study of images. In his personal scrapbooks, I included just here 2 of them. The interior, which is just stunning with the domed roof, and then also the pumping system and the pumping station. But there's also a refrigeration room and several other of the mechanics of the building and how he got it all to work and function. But did it just beautifully. Like all the mechanics are hidden from public view, and you just see the elegance of the design when you go to view the aquarium. Next, we see in 1903 the 20th Century Club. This was actually a women's club, and if you might recall that Ida Whittaker, his wife, was a member of the 20th Century Club, and likely a big reason that he was involved with this. This was located at the corner of Witherill and Columbia. It was the leader, Clara A. Avery, was on the board of directors and had put together the plans for this with George Mason at an estimated cost of just $60,000. The planning for this took roughly 10 years, and they used fundraisers to support this in the form of what we call subscription. So people would pay to be a subscriber, kind of paying to be a membership of a group. It was created with paving brick, red brick, and white sandstone exterior. The dining room was designed to seat up to 400 people. And I love this, that the room rates were set to be the same for all with no favoritism given to large subscribers. The house, to house many women's clubs of the city, is the reason why this was designed. And when it originally opened, it housed the 20th Century Club, of course, the Daughters of the Revolution, and many whist clubs. In 1925, we see this building needing expansion, and it was set for a $125,000 expansion to include an auditorium for 650 people, designed in the old Italian style as the original building was done, and Mason was also the architect of this expansion. So here's a fun fact for you about the Cadillac Automobile Company. So oftentimes, Albert Kahn has been given the designation for building the first factory in Detroit in 1905 for the Packard Motor Company. That is actually incorrect. The Cadillac Auto Company was designed the same year but completed first, and this was a Mason design. So it was the first automobile plant constructed of steel reinforced concrete. Both of the plants, the Packard designed by Kahn and the Cadillac plant designed by Mason, were done in cooperation with Julius Kahn, who was Albert's brother and civil engineer. The Cadillac plant was 76,500 square feet. It was $100,000 in the budget and was expected to be completed just by the end of the year in December 1905. I'm always shocked as we're going through these as how quickly these buildings came up. Like, people were committed. They would do them in just a few days, months, or less than a year, what nowadays would take several years to design and plan. The general manager of the Cadillac plant, H.M. Leland, said, quote, "We are going to put up the building as quick as the Lord will let us." Noting how quickly it actually did go up, because it's like I say, it was just a few months, and you can see it under construction. Even though they had just the products were being brought in by horse and wagon, but they still did it very quickly. In 1906, we see another plant coming up. This one not for automotive, but an Anderson Carriage Company plant, so to help out those carriages for the horses. Also in 1906, just a side note here, we see an article in the Detroit Free Press that said Detroit beat the record for new builds yet again. So this was an up-and-coming city, and Mason was very much an active part in it. We see a need, because it's growing so fast and people are coming into town, we see a need for a luxurious hotel, and hence the Pontchartrain gets designed and built in 1907. Mason consulted with Mr. Stanford White of New York in the design and build of this new grand hotel called the Pontchartrain. It was built to rival the Waldorf Astoria in New York City, which is the building that Stanford White was involved in designing. Sadly, Mr. White was murdered by millionaire Harry K. Thaw, who was the son of a coal and railroad baron and suffered from a mental illness, in New York City's Madison Square Garden in June 1906. So Mr. White never got to see the finished product, as he passed away before it was completed. The budget for the Pontchartrain was built on a $1 million budget for the exterior and design of the building itself, and sat on the site of the old Russell House that the construction started on December 1st, 1906. It was to be a 12-story building with 400 rooms and to open in January 07. Again, just shocking. 1 year construction of this huge hotel. The ending price was $2 million for the hotel with all of its furnishings. Both Mr. and Mrs. Mason were some of the first names to be included in the hotel registry when it opened its doors in 1907. In 1909, there was a $400,000 budget issued to support an addition to the Pontchartrain, to include a 1,000-person convention hall, 5 more floors to be added, and 150 more rooms. This would include a large hall and 13th floor, on the 13th floor, as well as kitchens, and on the 15th floor, and a top floor garden. Still a beautiful building today. Next, we have the Majestic, which was built for a budget of $100,000 and had just a gorgeous marble interior. Before we get into the Lincoln Motor Plant, in 1913, we have a fun note about Mason, who refused a commission for a proposed shelter near City Hall in honor of the late Alderman William P. Kingsley. He was noted as saying, "It will be an eyesore to the downtown district." I found that a little humorous. He was very much into design and a style, and he had an idea of how he wanted the city to look, so he did refuse commissions that didn't support that vision. Interestingly enough, William B. Stratton, who had worked for Mason in 1928, also refused this commission. In 1970, we see the Lincoln Motor Plant being developed at West Warren in Livernois. This was a 4-story brick and contract factory and a 1-story brick powerhouse. Next, in 1922, we see Mason designed the Detroit Yacht Club. It was a cost of $400,000 for the new clubhouse on the north shore of Belle Isle, and it was quoted to be the finest in America. It formally opened on May 31st, 1923, to 2,200 members. And just look at that top image with all of those people there. I don't think we've ever seen it that busy since, but absolutely fabulous. On this page, we can't go without mentioning in 1923, it was a 6-year project, but images are from 1923 from his personal records, the Detroit Masonic Temple. This was definitely the masterpiece of Mason. In 1904, we see there was an addition proposed to increase the size of the current structure by 50% of what had been the previous Masonic Temple. In 1920, when they had the groundbreaking, Detroit expected to have 20,000 people in attendance, but there were actually 50,000 people at the breaking of the soil. Mason, of course, was involved in this. The budget given on this was a whopping $4 million in 1920. It was to have a 5,000-person auditorium, and it was to be second to none in America. Designed in the Gothic Revival architecture and reflective of the 1770 Freemasons' first Grand Lodge in London. It was to be composed of 14 stories, or 210 feet tall, 550,000 square feet, and took 6 years to complete. In 1929, we see Mason wins a top award for Best Institutional Design with the Detroit chapter of the AIA for this building. This was the same year that Albert Kahn won an award for one of his designs. Since 1939, when Chicago Masonic Temple was demolished, the Detroit's Masonic Temple has been the largest in the world. If we jump ahead to 2013, we find a Detroit native, Jack White, paid $142,000 in back taxes to save the Masonic Temple from foreclosure. For this honor of doing this, he was the Scottish Rites Cathedral Theater was renamed the Jack White Theater for a time. Since then, it's been renamed the Masonic Cathedral Theater. There's much more information you can find in the Masonic Temple, and so I didn't want to focus too much on it here, just to give you some facts that you might not be aware of and aren't as easy to find about this magnificent structure. Now, we start to see a shift in the 1920s, mid to late 1920s, in Mason's design and plans. Instead of just building one or two buildings, this is when we start to see him planning cities and development and structures. So it starts out, before we get into this, I want to talk about one little fun article I read about Mason. He was on a jury in 1924. It was a jury of 9 awarding a European travel fellowship to architectural students at the University of Michigan. So he was very involved in trying to get new architects to come into Michigan and get their design ideas so we could build up the city. The 2 people who received this award in 1924, one was Ralph R. Calder of Detroit, and the other was a Miss Marion Frances Blood of Grand Rapids. It's just wonderful to see that at such a time as that. In 1928, then, we see George Mason mentioned as, quote, the Dean of Architects. This was coined during a Detroit Free Press competition for Better Homes magazine. Mason drew up the rules for this competition, and this was encouraging architects from across the country to submit drawings, which in size and cost will conform to the demands of the majority of Detroiters. They received ideas all over the country from Boston to Los Angeles. 4 homes were selected, and they're pictured here. The Indianwood, the Dearborn, the Birmingham, the Huntington, and all were currently being built. So these were supposed to be affordable housing, common to the time, different unique designs from across the country being brought into Michigan. In 1930, we see Branson v. Gamber. Again, this was of Robert O'Derrick, his partner, spoke of the 12th International Congress of Architects in Budapest, Hungary, and he referred to George D. Mason as, quote, one of our local constellations in the person of George D. Mason. That's how he was announced. In 1930, we see Mason called a pioneer in Detroit industries and one of the city's oldest and best-known architects. Now we're going to look at a plan that actually was never developed, but we start to see just how he really just wanted to bring history, and we see his architectural influence in the city was to create the plans to rebuild Fort Pontchartrain on Belle Isle. This was the design which he had established. It would have housed the Detroit Historical Society documents. So ideally, they were to collect funds by subscription, like had been done for the 20th Century Club, for the Women's Club, over a 2-year period. He was creating the design for the Fort Pontchartrain using Commandant Cadillac's papers from the 1701 original town. It was going to have 17 houses, including a church, a warehouse, 4 houses, a barn, an ice house, 2 gateways, 2 guardhouses, Cadillac's original house, house of the Alphonse de Tonte aide de camp, a feed barn, and others. Sadly, this was never created. This was a proposal, and but was never sought to fruition. On the image here on 1936, this was again where we see him going as a much larger scale than just 1 or 2 buildings. We see an image of the Parkside Housing Project of Detroit, both the model and also image of the Office on Housing Projects from the 1940s. So this was one of 3 Detroit housing projects. They were called the Brewsters, the Parkside, and the Herman Gardens. And the image at the top of the page where it says, "We say yes for you, Detroit." So we've all heard the yes to Detroit. It originated back in the 1930s. This was a full-page ad in the Detroit Free Press that listed 100 members who were saying yes to Detroit for a $100 million construction program that was being supported by the Federal Housing Administration and with the National Housing Act. And this was the logo that was created to support it. So this is one of 3 that was done, but this was the Parkside Housing Project from 1936. So though there were many more churches were designed and built, here are 15 houses of worship completed by George Mason. As was mentioned earlier, he was studied the Protestant faith and was a strong churchgoer, so it's no surprise that he was involved in making several churches throughout the area, all very elaborate and beautiful. We're just going to talk about a handful of them here today. The first is the First Presbyterian Church, which was done in a Romanesque revival style. Next is the Trinity Protestant Episcopal Church, done in the Gothic style. And the last on this page is the Temple Bethel of Detroit. I love this image of the dome as it's being structurally built. So this was done as Mason and Reed Hill partnership, and the partnership split prior to its completion. I do believe Albert Kahn was also involved in this design, so that we had several incredible architects working to develop this one. It's absolutely stunning. Next, we have the St. Paul's Episcopal Church of Detroit. This was located at 952 to 66 Woodward Avenue in Hancock. It was built on a budget of $380,000 to seat 1,100 people, and it was made out of Bedford limestone. It was quoted as an imposing structure, to say the least. In the middle of the page, we have the Woodward Baptist Church in Detroit, which was Gothic brick and stone with a bell tower. So very traditional bell tower type of church you would see at any corner in Europe. In 1923, we see the Redeemer Presbyterian Church, built on a $200,000 budget at West Cram Boulevard between Trumbull and Sterling Avenue. This was done in the English Gothic style with a spire. It included a gymnasium, kitchen, and Sunday school rooms. We see a departure from those traditional churches in the Third Church of Christ Scientists, built in 1923. This included Greek Doric style using Indiana limestone and was, quote, entirely fireproof. It had a 1,200-person amphitheater-style auditorium surrounded by an Ionic colonnade and 800 people seating for Sunday school. In the middle here, we see the Trinity Methodist Episcopal Church, built the same year, and this was located at Woodward and Buena Vista Avenue in Highland Park in an Italian Renaissance style. It had a 1,000-person capability auditorium for a budget of $275,000. And it included a new heating plant with forced ventilation using washed air. Also on this page is the First Methodist Church of Dearborn. In 1926, we see the Pilgrim Congregational Church of Detroit. We're going to see this style come up later in another church. In 1929, we see the Parish House for the First English Evangelical Lutheran Church of Detroit. This was an English manor designed to match the existing structure, and it used oil boilers for heat. The last church on this page was built in 1930. It was the Central Woodward Christian Church of Detroit. George Mason won the institutional award for this structure from the Detroit chapter of the AIA. This is the same year that Kahn won for the Fisher Building as the best commercial structure for that year. We see the Church of Christ Scientists show up again in 1939. This was the sixth Church of Christ Scientists, built on Kercheval from Manistee to Ashland Avenue for a budget of $250,000 to support an 800-person auditorium, a Sunday school of 500, a reading room, a bookshop, office, and a director's room. In 1948, we see the Drayton Avenue Presbyterian Church designs here. And finally, this church, as well as the Presbyterian, were completed after Mason had passed away, is the St. James Lutheran Church in Grosse Pointe Farms, located at 170 McKinley Road, just behind the Higbie, Maxon, Agney offices, and next to Richard Elementary School. I don't know if a lot of people realize that this is a George Mason church. George Mason was a natural-born leader and educator. Again, he was the oldest child in his family and the only son. Throughout his career, he mentored up-and-coming architects, and naturally, he designed several schools throughout Wayne County. So here's just 11 of them. Again, there's so many he did, so we're only going to touch on a few here. And I've only have real details on a few, so we're just going to focus on those. You have the Romeo High School. You have the Dearborn High School, which was built for a budget of $400,000 to support 800 students in a 400-student auditorium, and it was located next to the existing school on Garrison. We have the Brainerd School in Dearborn and the Edgewood School in Taylor. Next, we have the Whitmore Bowles School in Dearborn. We have the J.H. Tomlinson School in Detroit. And here in the center, we see the Thomas A. Edison School in Dearborn. Interesting note about this one is Ford sold a parcel on Elmsdale Avenue between Gregory and Francis for $45,000 to support this new school. For an additional $200,000, this school was built with 10 classrooms, a library, auditorium, and gymnasium. Also on this page are the U.S. Grant School in Detroit and the Edward Cerveny School in Detroit. Next, we have the Lindbergh School in Dearborn and a proposed Lebo-Leonard school unit to be funded by the Detroit Board of Education in 1931. This would have been a $5.5 million program with 30 units and 15,000 students. I do not have any images of this, but it was likely to support the 3 building complexes that were talked about earlier, including the Packard School, or the Packard development. In 1948, we see the last school we're going to talk about, which was the Zena Pitcher School. This was actually built after Mason had passed away. So he was working literally right up until he passed away at age 91. Just amazing. While developing Detroit's landscape, George Mason designed some elegant homes for his wealthy clients, as well as encouraged ideas for affordable housing throughout Metro Detroit. Here are 19 examples of these homes, and this is my favorite part. So first we're going to talk about the Ransom Gillis House from 1876. So many of you may recognize this home. It has been renovated. It was done by a local TV station and done and advertised while it was being done. So this is the Ransom Gillis House. So this was located, it is located Alfred and John R. on Brush Street. But here's a fun fact you might not know about. So between 1903 and 1907, this house was rented to Mary Chase Perry Stratton, who, by the way, was the woman in the image of the office of Mason and Rice. So this property was rented for 4 years. The carriage house was used by Mary as an art studio. In 1907, Mary moved to her new building, which is now the Pewabic Pottery Building, which was designed by William B. Stratton. She and Mr. Stratton did not marry until 1918, so I just found that fascinating. Another image I have just here with the Ransom Gillis House is I was in Normandy, France recently, and I just found that turret. I saw a house with this turret on it, and I just found that fascinating that you could see that French influence showing up in his earliest designs. Next, we're going to move on to the Joseph H. Berry residence, which was located at 50 Lakeshore, Grosse Pointe Farms, and it was called Edgemere. This was an English manor-style home located on 15 acres from McKinley to Sunset Lane to Kercheval. In 1895, we see discussions in Mason's journals about work on a greenhouse for this property. This was the first of the full-time residence in Grosse Pointe, so this house was built to be a full-time residence. Most at this point in time, prior to this, had been built as summer cottages, even though they were large and grand. So Mr. Berry was the co-owner of Berry Brothers Varnish, Inc. He died suddenly in 1907 from an infection, and it was noted that he had the largest estate ever probated in Wayne County at that time. Sadly, this property was torn down in 1942. Next to it, we see the William A. McGraw House in Grosse Pointe Farms, or it was known as the Poplars. This is a Queen Anne cottage, which was very popular in 1886 era. And we see journal entries as early as 1883, where he's meeting with McGraw to design this building. So this was built with 3 stories and a wraparound porch. It was located on Lakeshore Drive next to the Dyer residence on 10 acres. Mr. McGraw ran the A.C. McGraw and Company, one of the oldest and most successful mercantile firms in Detroit. This property was renovated in 1927 by Robert O'Derrick and now is a colonial-style home on 71 Lakeshore. I just cannot see how they got this house to that house, but it might be like how they do so much today, and they saved one wall and then basically rebuilt the property. So the next door neighbor to the one we just discussed was John B. Dyer, and this was his residence, built also in 1886. This was named the Beau Rivage, or Beautiful Shore. In 1898, Mr. Dyer brought a railway line to the points along Grosse Pointe Boulevard, which is the reason why the boulevard is so wide. So they wasn't too popular with his neighbors. Not a lot of people appreciated that. This particular house was demolished also in 1942. Next, we have the William C. McKinley residence. This ran from Jefferson to Rivard in the Grosse Pointes. McKinley was a Yale graduate and a manager of the Michigan Car Company Works. This beautiful boathouse there on the water. Next, we have the Henry G. Sherrard House. This is still located at 59 Lakeshore Drive. It was commissioned by Joseph Berry, who we talked about in the previous slide, for his daughter Charlotte and her husband. So this is created in a Victorian style, a Victorian revival style, and still is there today. Jumping into Detroit for a couple of homes, we see the Donald J. McDonald residence. This was located at 1616, or is located at 1616 Boston Boulevard in Detroit. This was George D. Mason's sister's husband, so this is where his nephew, who ended up working for him, was raised. It's also noted that the newspaper wasn't clear when Mrs. Mason passed away. One article said she passed away at this house, another at her existing residence where she was. So it's possible she passed away here. In the newspaper, this was noted, or on the architectural drawing on the top, it's noted as a, quote, Greek revival style. I don't know that I would have called it that, but that's what Mason called it. In 1917, we get to the Fremont Woodruff residence. This is located currently at 1 Donovan Place in Grosse Pointe. This is a neoclassical architectural style. At the time was designed to be 9,500 square feet with limestone and stucco exterior and a slate roof. The address for 1 Donovan Place was previously 17160 East Jefferson and owned most of the land that is now Donovan Place, along with homes on Woodland Place owned some of that land as well. The property lot was 140 feet wide by 1,053 feet deep, or 3.5 acres. In 1948, this property was assessed at $98,000. Mrs. Woodruff was a Detroit, Mr. Woodruff was a Detroit attorney. The property was sold in the 1950s by Miss Mary Woodruff and listed at $80,000, and this was in 1945 or 1949 is when it was listed and sold in the 50s. The current street was named after Frank Donovan, who purchased the property in 1975 and subdivided it. Of all the buildings there's, I believe, 4 buildings on the block right now, and 2 of them are original structures from the design. This property, 1 Donovan Place, has been extensively renovated and even made larger in size by the current residents. Next to it, we have the stately Colonial by John W. Staley residence, built at 1040 Harvard, and is still a property there today. It currently is 5,500 square feet with 7 bedrooms, 3 full baths, 2 half baths, and a 2-car garage. Mr. Staley was the senior VP of the People's State Bank in 1970. This was listed for sale by Mrs. Staley in 1941 after Mr. Staley died for $35,000, and it was last sold in 2021 for $850,000. Next, we have the John T. Woodhouse residence in 1920. This is located at 33 Oldbrook Lane, which was previously numbered as 325 Lakeshore and Grosse Pointe Farms. This is a Tudor revival, just shy of 10,000 square feet, with 5 bedrooms, 3.5 baths, plus 3 additional bedrooms and then a bath on the 3rd floor for the maids' quarters. Mr. Woodhouse worked as a clerk in 1880 and eventually bought out the company in the small tobacco product manufacturing that he was working. He was married 3 times. His first wife, he had 6 children and died young. His second wife, he divorced after 13 years, and his third wife he married in 1929. It's a sad story, though, for Mr. Woodhouse. After the economic collapse in 1929 and severe financial losses, he did commit suicide in 1930. So the company and the property was owned then by his son John until John passed away in 1967. It was sold eventually in 1974 for $165,000. So I believe this is just the second owners that still own this home. Absolutely beautiful. We're jumping back to Detroit for the Charles T. Fisher residence, which was built in 1921. This is located at 670 West Boston Boulevard. This was a junior league house in 2018. It is 16,000 square foot with the original organ still in place and a private chapel. Charles was the co-founder of the Fisher Body Company along with his brother and uncle. It is currently owned by Hill Harper from The Good Doctor. In 1925, Frank E. Fisher residence was developed at 1175 3 Mile Drive in Grosse Pointe Park. I had the privilege of touring this property following the lecture in June, as the current owner was attending in the lecture and offered to give me a tour. Absolutely beautiful. It's been restored magnificently and is just as grand as it was in the day it was built. It is an English-style cottage architecture with 8,200 square feet, likely more now because they have renovated the third floor to be a library. It has 6 bedrooms, 6 full baths, 2 half baths, at least it did back in the time when it sold in 1996, and a 3-car attached garage. It was first on the market in 1937 for $55,000. They turned down an offer for $40,000. And the last time it was sold in 1996 was for $475,000. Now we have a little bit of our company's history in this next home. In 1926, this was known as the Higbie House, or Mrs. Harley Green Higbie. It was located on Moran and Lakeshore in Grosse Pointe Farms. It was, the address, I believe, was 191 Lakeshore. Later became 201 Lakeshore. This was a neoclassical revival style on 8.5 acres. Mrs. Higbie was a nationally known golfer. I don't know if everybody knows that. And Mr. Higbie was a Chicago stockbroker and a World War I veteran. They had 2 children. One was Harley Jr., and the other was Hugo Scheer Higbie. Hugo Higbie was Higbie Maxon Agney's founder, which we have an image of him here. This property was demolished and subdivided in 1988 into 15 properties. This includes now Orchard Lane, Shearer Place, and Higbie Court, located right by the Grosse Pointe Academy. In 1929, we have these beautiful preliminary sketches of the Lynn McNaughton residence located at 109 Kenwood in Grosse Pointe Farms. This is a stone and stucco sprawling English Tudor with over 10,000 square feet on nearly an acre and a half. Mr. McNaughton was the vice president of sales for Cadillac from 1905 onward. It has been owned by several prestigious people, including Benson Ford Jr. and Detroit Tiger Cecil Fielder. It was last sold in 2009 for $1.5 million and is still an imposing structure today. Next, we see one that is probably familiar to many people, as this was the 2024 the Junior League of Detroit House. This was located at 315 Lakeland and is the Dr. James Milton Robb House. This is a Tudor with brick and stucco siding and a slate roof. It's over 7,000 square feet with 6 bedrooms, 5 full baths, 2 half baths, and an attached 3-car garage. Dr. Robb was the valedictorian of his class in 1904 Detroit College of Medicine, which is now Wayne State University. He lived on Lakeland for 31 years and raised 4 children here. This house was last sold in 2022 for $882,000. Next, we have the Buell Mendelsohn home in Grosse Pointe Farms from 1930, and this is a beautiful preliminary sketch of this home. This was located at 820 Ellier Place, then 16500 East Jefferson. This was located on 6 acres where Bishop and Ellier are today. Louis Mendelssohn's daughter, Lydia, lived here until her death in 1988. The house was raised in 1996 and divided into 15 lots. We see the Dr. George E. Fay residence located at 784 Berkshire in Grosse Pointe Park. It is still here today. Currently, it's 3,000 square feet with 5 bedrooms, 3 baths, 3.5 baths, and a 2-car garage. Dr. Fay was a prominent surgeon in the area. Previously, Dr. Fay had lived at 2253 Burn Street in Detroit, which was also built by Mason in 1915. This property was listed in 1933 for sale for $50,000 and last sold in 1994 for $171,000. It looks very similar today as it did back when it was originally built. Next, we have the Albert H. Schmitz residence at 15840 Lakeview Court in Grosse Pointe Park. Albert Schmitz was the treasurer and general manager of Trogo Schmitz & Sons. This is an English Tudor style, just shy of 8,000 square feet, located on Lake St. Clair. It was listed in 1934 by Mr. Schmitz for $200,000. It was later rented for $650 a month in 1940 while they wintered in Florida, and eventually sold by the family in 1952 for $50,000. You can see quite a few differences in the top original sketch done by Mason and then the final home as it was built on the bottom. Mason's drawings always amaze me because they look more like art pieces than architectural sketches. He was truly an artist at heart. The last home we're going to talk about was built in 1937, and it is at 66 Sunningdale and Grosse Pointe Shores. We're not sure who it was designed for, but it is a colonial with just shy of 4,000 square feet. It currently has 5 bedrooms, 5.5 baths, and a 2-car garage. In 1941, it was listed for sale for $25,000 and last sold in 2000 for $1 with an estimated $925,000 value. One of the things I wanted to show you on this slide is on the bottom right, this is a copy of some of the type of information we have in our archives at Higbie, Maxon, Agney. This real estate company has been in business for over 90 years, and for that, we have a lot of history of all the homes in Grosse Pointe. So a lot of my research will come from our own archive. So given all you have seen of the creativity of George D. Mason, in what city do you think he lived? What kind of home did he have? And did he live in a design of his own making? So these are the questions I asked the audience. So most people did guess correctly. They guessed Detroit. What kind of home did he have? Large, small, that kind of thing. A lot of people thought he'd have a larger home. And did he do one of his own design? People said probably because, he was a well-known architect at the time. So this is a little bit of a surprise for people. So George Mason lived at 746 Collingwood in Detroit until his wife's death. He died himself at his home at the Wiltshire Apartments. So he was really an apartment guy. He and his wife were both buried in the Evergreen Cemetery mausoleum in Detroit. And I just love what was written on their tombs here. George D. Mason, beloved husband of, and Ida Whitaker, beloved wife of. That pretty much says it all. They were very focused on each other. So in wrapping up this presentation, I was really struck by one of the articles I read about George Mason's obituary in 1948. And it was referencing Rome was not built in a day. So the real thought is that there could be no real city unless it has behind it a splendid tradition. And I'm going to read an excerpt from this article to you today. This is the article where I learned about Melchers, the sculpting artist Melchers, who introduced Kahn to Mason. This is talking about further their relationship. So Mason was contributing his time and energy, his magnificent artistic genius, and his boundless energy merely in the joy of friendship. Both Kahn and Mason now live in that house, not made by hands, as does Julius T. Melchers. These are the things that go to make a city with a tradition, a city with a soul. Multiply such incidents by the many thousands, and you will begin to understand the real Detroit, the city that was not made in a day. So again, just want to bring to your attention that I am a realtor with Higbie, Maxon, Agney. I do these lectures just out of a passion for understanding the area and the buildings around us. We moved to this area because it is beautiful. We love the architecture, and so I make it a point to study and learn about it. That being said, if you live in a historic home in our area or in the Southeast Michigan area, I'm happy to research your property for you. If you're within the Grosse Pointes, we do have 90 years of archives in our basement, and I'm happy to look up your home or property you have an interest in and let you know what we have on file. As we wrap it up, I just want to say, as I usually do, that homes are more than just location, size, number of bedrooms and bathrooms. George D. Mason and other premier architects of the earliest 20th century truly bring this to light in the Grosse Pointes. I hope this gives you an appreciation for the type of home you have come to know and love in this area. If you do have a historic home, please make sure you find out more about it if you're going to make changes to it. We want to make sure you enhance the value of the area and your property and not diminish it, which can happen if you aren't sensitive to the property that you have. Thank you very much for your time. I truly appreciate it.